Write in the comments where you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like. There are whispers in the static of a recording that never reached the jury. Tonight, we unseal Case File 73H, a forgotten event known only as the Harrow Creek incident, and examine the one piece of testimony that was deliberately erased from history. A story so unsettling, the official record insists it never happened. Write in the comments where you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like. Some things, once heard, can never be forgotten. Welcome to the Obsidian Archive. Tonight we unseal a file that officially does not exist. It concerns a place that has been scrubbed from most modern maps, and an event that lives on only in whispers. We are going to Harrow Creek, a town swallowed by the fog of history and official denial. The date is October 17th, 1978. In the annals of public record, it was an uneventful Tuesday. The national news spoke of economic policy and distant conflicts. But in the secluded valley of Harrow Creek, nestled deep within the Appalachian foothills, something broke the mundane silence of the world. It wasn't a sound that shattered the night. It was the opposite. It was a sudden, profound, and unnatural cessation of all noise. Crickets stopped chirping. The wind ceased its passage through the ancient pines. Every dog in the valley fell silent at once. Residents would later, in hushed and scattered accounts, describe it as a pressure, a physical weight in the air that felt like the world was holding its breath. For 13 minutes, from 9:47 p.m. to 10 p.m., Harrow Creek was the quietest place on earth. And then the light came. Not a flash, but a slow bloom of cobalt blue energy that pulsed from the heart of the Black Fork Woods. It cast no shadows. It emitted no heat. It simply was. It illuminated every house, every tree, every face pressed against a window pane in a cold, sterile luminescence. This was the Harrow Creek anomaly. When you search for it in government databases, you will find nothing. No geological surveys reported seismic activity. No weather stations logged atmospheric phenomena. No local law enforcement records from that night have ever been declassified. It's a ghost in the machine, a blank page where a terrifying chapter should be. The story of what happened was systematically erased, the witnesses discredited, and their accounts buried under the crushing weight of official narrative. But the truth does not simply vanish. It seeps into the cracks. It survives in forgotten boxes, in the memories of the aged, and in the testimony that was never entered into record. Before the men in unmarked sedans arrived, before the information blackout was imposed, there was one man who saw the immediate aftermath. His name was Sheriff Dale Brody, a 30-year veteran of the county, a man who knew every creek bed and fire road like the lines on his own hand. His official log for that night is a masterclass in mundane understatement. It notes a single call regarding unusual lights and ends with the entry, "Cause determined to be meteorological, all clear." But in a dusty footlocker, discovered after his death in 2005, a small, leather-bound notebook tells a different story. This is his real report. This is the testimony that was never entered into record. Brody's notes begin at 9:51 p.m. The switchboard was dead, but his personal radio crackled with a single panicked call from a farmer on the western ridge before it too went silent. He didn't drive towards the light. He drove towards the silence. He wrote of an oppressive quiet that made the engine of his cruiser sound like a cannon blast. As he neared the Black Fork woods, his headlights began to flicker and die, forcing him to continue on foot. The air, he noted, smelled of ozone and hot metal, a scent he hadn't experienced since his time in the service. He found no crater, no wreckage, no sign of impact. Instead, he found a perfect circle in the forest floor, 50 yards in diameter, where everything was coated in a fine, gray, almost greasy ash. The trees at the edge of the circle were not burned, but desiccated. Brittle to the touch, their leaves crumbled into dust when he brushed against them. The ground inside the circle was cold, unnaturally so despite the humid October air. He knelt, touching the ash. It didn't feel like burnt wood. It was metallic, leaving a strange, shimmering residue on his fingers. That's when he saw the tracks. They weren't animal, and they weren't human. They were delicate, three-pronged indentations leading from the center of the circle into the dark woods, spaced with an impossibly long and uniform stride. He followed them for 100 yards before they simply stopped, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. He was a lawman, trained to find evidence, to follow a logical chain. None of that applied here. As dawn threatened to break, 2 black sedans rolled down the fire road, no sirens, no lights. Men in dark suits, who carried no badges but held an unquestionable authority, informed him the area was now under federal jurisdiction. They took his camera. They took his notes. They told him what he would write in his official log. Sheriff Brody went home, opened his private notebook, and wrote down everything he had truly seen. A secret he would keep for the rest of his life. In the days and weeks that followed the Harrow Creek anomaly, a carefully constructed reality was presented to the public. The silence, the light, the fear, it was all methodically explained away. The official narrative was a patchwork of plausible, if disparate, scientific phenomena. The local paper, the Harrow Creek Chronicle, ran a headline 2 days later. Rare seismic event causes local power surge. Quoting a geologist from a state university, a man who, records show, was never actually there, the article described a localized subterranean gas release that could, under specific atmospheric conditions, create a brief, silent, electrical discharge known as ball lightning. It was clean, scientific, and utterly dismissive. The phone outages were blamed on a squirrel chewing through a primary trunk line. The perimeter set up by the men in suits was explained as a necessary precaution by the Department of Energy conducting a routine environmental survey. Every strange report was given a mundane explanation. Every witness who spoke of something more was gently painted as confused or mistaken, a victim of small-town rumor and overactive imagination. This campaign was remarkably effective. In the absence of any other information, people began to accept it. They wanted to believe it. The alternative was too unsettling. But the official narrative, like a poorly built house, had cracks in its foundation. Why would a routine survey require armed guards and a 72-hour media blackout? Why do FAA records from that night show a TFR, a temporary flight restriction, placed over the valley citing national security? Satellite imagery from the era, recently declassified, shows a massive thermal bloom over the Black Fork woods at 9:47 p.m., inconsistent with any known geological or meteorological event. The official story was a firewall designed to contain a truth deemed too dangerous for public consumption. It was a narrative built not to explain, but to obscure, Every press release, every newspaper article was a brick in a wall built around a central, terrifying secret. A secret held only by those who were there, and whose first-hand accounts constitute the testimony that was never entered into record. Official reports can be fabricated, evidence can be confiscated, but memory is a stubborn, resilient thing. While most of Harrow Creek was silenced by confusion and authority, there was one witness they couldn't easily dismiss because she saw more than anyone else. Her name was Evelyn Reed. A retired ornithologist, she lived in a small, isolated cabin on Miller's Ridge, giving her a perfect, unobstructed view of the Black Fork Woods. She wasn't just an observer. She was a scientist. Her cabin was equipped with parabolic microphones for recording bird calls and a powerful telescopic camera for photography. On the night of October 17th, she was awake, documenting the migration of nocturnal owls. Her equipment was running. What she recorded was the testimony that was never entered into record, the single most important piece of evidence from that night, and the reason for the subsequent cover-up. We have obtained a copy of her audio recording, smuggled out by a sympathetic county clerk before the original was seized and likely destroyed. That is the moment the anomaly began. The 13 minutes of absolute silence. Evelyn, in a frantic, whispered narration on a separate handheld recorder, described the pressure in her ears, the feeling of dread. Then, her parabolic microphone picked up something else. Not a sound from the valley, but a sound from above. A low, resonant frequency that vibrated more than it was heard. Then the light appeared. Her photographs, which have never been seen, allegedly showed not a simple ball of light, but a structured, geometric object of immense size, descending silently into the woods. But the most chilling part of her testimony concerned what happened after the object landed. Through her telescope, she saw figures, tall, impossibly thin, moving with a fluid grace that was not human. They moved through the woods at the edge of the clearing Sheriff Brody would later discover. They were not exploring. According to Evelyn's whispered account, they were collecting samples. Soil. Flora. They moved with purpose, with an unnerving efficiency. 2 days later, the men in suits visited Evelyn Reed. They didn't threaten her. They were polite, professional. They explained that she had witnessed a sensitive military drone test. They told her that her recordings and photographs were now classified government property. She refused. The next day, a small, localized fire was reported at her cabin. The official cause was listed as faulty wiring. Evelyn Reed was moved to a state-run care facility where she was heavily sedated and diagnosed with late-onset schizophrenia. Her testimony was never heard in any official capacity. It was buried, along with her research, her credibility, and her freedom. She became Witness Zero, the woman who saw everything, and whose truth was the one they feared the most. Write in the comments where you are watching from and at what time so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like. Some truths are buried so deep, the shovel that finds them is mistaken for a weapon. The room had no name. It wasn't an official interrogation suite in a precinct, nor was it a sterile office in a federal building. It was an anonymous space, rented under a shell corporation, located on the 3rd floor of a nondescript commercial building overlooking a rain-slicked alley. The only furniture was a simple metal table and 3 chairs. The walls were a dull, institutional beige, absorbing sound and light, creating a vacuum of consequence. This was a place designed for conversations that would never officially happen. On one side of the table sat a man we will call Elias. He was in his late 40s, with the weary eyes of someone who had carried a heavy secret for too long. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them on the table. Opposite him was lead investigator Marcus Davies, a man whose reputation for closing impossible cases was legendary within certain circles. The third chair, in the corner, remained empty, a silent observer in this clandestine theater. This was not an interrogation. It was a preliminary interview, a sounding, a test to see if Elias's story was worth the immense risk it represented. The recording device on the table was a small, unmarked black box, its single red light a blinking eye in the dim room. But this recording, as we would later discover, was never destined for an evidence locker. It was a ghost file, created to be erased. Davies began, his voice a low, calm monotone that betrayed none of the gravity of the situation. "Let's start from the beginning, Elias. No assumptions. Tell me what you saw on the night of the incident." Elias swallowed hard, his gaze darting towards the single reinforced window, showing nothing but brick and weeping mortar. He began to speak, his voice barely a whisper. He recounted details of a high-level meeting, names that could topple institutions, and a transaction that went far beyond financial crime. He spoke of a sequence of events that directly contradicted the official narrative that had been fed to the public, a narrative that had neatly closed a case of corporate espionage, when, according to Elias, it was something far more sinister, involving intelligence agencies and off-the-books operations. Every word he uttered was a potential death sentence. Davies didn't interrupt. He just listened, his expression unreadable, letting the silence between Elias's sentences hang in the air, like thick smoke. This interview, lasting 2 hours and 47 minutes, would form the basis of the testimony that was never entered into record. It was a foundational truth, spoken aloud in a room that didn't exist, recorded on a device that would be wiped, and heard by a man whose career was about to be systematically dismantled. The air was thick with the unspoken agreement that this conversation could get them both killed. Elias wasn't just a witness, he was a liability. And in the world he had stumbled into, liabilities are always managed. Every official action, no matter how secret, leaves a trace. A requisition form, a vehicle log, a visitor sign-in sheet, a keycard swipe. It's a trail of digital and paper breadcrumbs that, when followed, tells a story. The story we were looking for was that of the preliminary interview with Elias. According to the timeline we had pieced together from ancillary sources, investigator Davies met with Elias on the evening of October 12th. An interview of that sensitivity, even if off-site, would require certain protocols. A vehicle would need to be checked out from the motor pool, a temporary burn room would need to be secured. A case file, even a temporary, heavily coded one, would need to be opened. We started with the obvious. Davies's official activity log for that week. The entry for October 12th was suspiciously mundane. It read, 1822 Tevro, Administrative Review of Cold Case Files. Office. It was a perfect alibi, plausible, dull, and utterly unverifiable, but it was too clean. Davies was a field agent, not a desk jockey. 4 hours of paperwork on a Tuesday night was out of character. We dug deeper, filing Freedom of Information Act requests that were met with redactions and delays. So we turned to less official channels. a source from the departmental archives, who will remain anonymous, granted us supervised access to the original paper logs from that year before they were digitized and potentially sanitized. We spent days under the low, fluorescent hum of the city records basement, the air thick with the smell of decaying paper. We examined the motor pool checkout log for the entire month of October. On the 12th, every vehicle was accounted for, signed out to other officers for official duties. Except one, a dark, unmarked sedan, fleet number 71B. The checkout line was blank, but the return line, logged at 2314, was signed with a hasty, almost illegible scrawl. We photographed it and ran it through a handwriting analysis program, comparing it to known samples of Davies's signature. It was a 94% match. He had taken the car, but hadn't signed for it on the way out. A small act of concealment, but a critical one. This was the first crack in the official story. The car gave us a new lead. We cross-referenced its GPS data, which was supposed to be wiped weekly, but was often stored on legacy servers. After weeks of petitioning, we received a corrupted data file. Buried within thousands of lines of code were fragmented coordinates. One set of coordinates, time-stamped at 1903 on October 12th, pointed directly to the commercial building where we believe the interview took place. The official record was a lie. A car was taken without being signed for. An investigator was not in his office. A location was visited that had no connection to any official case. Each discovery confirmed that powerful forces had worked to erase this event, to ensure that the testimony of Elias and the interview itself would never become part of the official record. They had scrubbed the files, but they forgot about the ghosts in the machine and the smudges of ink on paper. A man like Marcus Davies doesn't simply vanish from the narrative. He was, by all accounts, a force of nature within the department, a 20-year veteran with an unmatched closure rate and a reputation for incorruptibility. His colleagues described him as relentless, obsessive, and fiercely protective of his witnesses. He was the kind of investigator you wanted on your side, and the last person you'd want coming after you. Yet, just 6 months after his clandestine interview with Elias, Davies took an early retirement, citing personal health reasons. He sold his home, disconnected his numbers, and seemingly dropped off the face of the earth. The official story was that the job had finally burned him out. But the timing was too coincidental to ignore. We began to construct a psychological and professional profile of Davies, hoping to understand the man who heard the testimony that was never entered into record. We spoke with 3 of his former partners, all on condition of strict anonymity. One told us, Marcus saw things in black and white. There was the truth, and there was the lie. He didn't have much patience for anything in between. Another recalled, towards the end he became paranoid. He was convinced his office was bugged, his car was being followed. We all thought he was cracking up, but now I'm not so sure. His case files from that final year tell a story of their own. His meticulous, detailed reports become shorter, more cryptic. He began to use coded language and personal shorthand, as if writing notes for himself that he knew others would read. It was the behavior of a man who felt he was being watched. The critical question is whether Davies was a willing participant in the cover-up or its first victim. Did he bury Elias's testimony to protect the system he had served for 2 decades? Or did he try to bring it to light, only to be silenced and forced out by that very system? we found a clue in an old, decommissioned evidence database, a draft of a supplemental report for a completely unrelated case filed by Davies 2 days after the interview. The report contained a single anomalous sentence that had no bearing on the case it was attached to. Civic virtue requires an audit of the Nightingale Protocol. There is no official protocol named Nightingale. We believe this was a message, a final desperate attempt to create a record, however obscure. Nightingale may have been his code name for Elias, the witness who sang. And civic virtue might have been the name of the shadowy operation Elias had exposed. Davies wasn't covering it up. He was trying to sound the alarm in the only way he could without being eliminated. He was a man who heard an impossible truth and was left with an impossible choice: bury it and live, or fight for it and be erased. What becomes of a witness whose testimony is never recorded? For a person like Elias, stepping forward was an act of self-immolation. His life, as he knew it, ended the moment he sat down opposite Investigator Davies. The logical next step for a witness of his importance would be entry into the Federal Witness Security Program, or WITSEC. A new name, a new identity, a new life, all in exchange for testimony. We filed inquiries, searched databases, and spoke with legal experts. The answer was always the same: no one matching Elias's description under any possible name had ever been processed through the official WITSEC program. He doesn't exist in their records. This presents two terrifying possibilities. The first is that Davies, knowing the official channels were compromised, arranged for a private, off-the-books protection detail. This would involve immense personal risk and resources, creating a ghost identity completely outside of any government oversight. Elias would be a true phantom, his safety dependent entirely on the secrecy and funding of a small, clandestine network. He would be living in constant fear, not just of the people he testified against, but of the very system that was supposed to protect him. His life would be a permanent state of looking over his shoulder, a prison without walls. This scenario, while bleak, at least offers a sliver of hope that Elias survived. The second possibility is far more sinister. It suggests that the witness protection offered to Elias was a euphemism, a lie told to secure his cooperation. After he gave his preliminary testimony, after Davies and the powers that be had everything they needed from him, he was no longer an asset. He was a loose end. In this scenario, Elias was not protected. He was eliminated. His disappearance was the final, brutal act of redacting a human life to ensure his testimony was never entered into any record, anywhere. The silence surrounding his fate is deafening. There is no paper trail because there was no process. There was only a problem and a solution. We found a single chilling piece of anecdotal evidence that supports this darker theory. A retired janitor who worked in the commercial building where the interview took place told us he remembered a special cleaning job on the 3rd floor that night. He wasn't allowed on the floor, but he saw the crew that went in. They weren't the usual cleaners. They were quiet, efficient men in unmarked coveralls who carried specialized equipment. They didn't just clean the room, they sterilized it. They scrubbed the space of any trace that someone had ever been there. This is the ultimate tragedy of the testimony that was never entered into record. It's a story that not only got buried, but its teller may have been buried along with it. His voice silenced forever to protect a secret we are still trying to unearth. Write in the comments where you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like. Some truths are not buried in graves, but in rooms without windows. Narrator. Deep beneath the anodyne architecture of the Sterling Federal Building, beyond the public-facing offices and polished marble floors, exists a place designed to swallow sound and secret. It's known as a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. It is a vault for conversations that, according to the state, must never reach the outside world. On October 14th, 2003, this particular room, designated SCIF 7, became the tomb for a testimony that would have rewritten the official history of the Ethelberg chemical spill. The public was told it was a tragic accident, a failure of aging infrastructure. The truth, however, was far more deliberate and far more sinister. The individual providing the testimony was Dr. Aris Thorne, a senior chemical engineer at Omnicorp, the parent company behind the Ethelberg plant. He was not a whistleblower in the traditional sense. He was a man summoned, compelled to speak by a clandestine congressional oversight committee that had caught wind of a discrepancy, a black budget project that didn't add up. The air in SCIF 7 was cold, recycled, and heavy with unspoken threats. Thorne, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and trembling hands, sat at a simple steel table. Across from him were three figures, their faces intentionally kept in shadow, their identities protected by layers of classification. They were not there to seek justice. They were there to measure the blast radius of a truth bomb. For 6 hours, Thorne spoke. His voice, captured by a single high-fidelity microphone, detailed a program codenamed Project Chimera. He explained that the Ethelberg spill was no accident. It was the controlled demolition of a compromised facility, a scorched earth protocol to destroy evidence of illegal chemical weapon synthesis being conducted for a private military contractor. He provided schematics, shipping manifests he had copied, and names of executives, liaisons, and a shadowy logistics expert known only as the quartermaster. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance, it was treason conducted on American soil. The committee members listened impassively. They asked few questions. Their purpose was not discovery, but containment. They needed to know the full extent of the rot, so they could know precisely how much of the foundation to tear out and replace without the public ever noticing the renovation. Dr. Thorne's testimony was a masterclass in damning detail. He recounted conversations, described hidden laboratories built within the main plant, and outlined the illegal waste disposal methods that had been poisoning the local water table for years before the accident. He was, in effect, signing his own death warrant. But perhaps he believed the sanctity of the room and the congressional seal would protect him. He was tragically mistaken. As the 6th hour concluded, the lead inquisitor, a silhouette known only as Control, thanked him for his cooperation. The recording was stopped. The transcript was marked Eyes Only, T5 Clearance. Dr. Aris Thorne was escorted from the room, never to be seen in a public or official capacity again. The testimony he gave, the explosive truth he detailed, was now a state secret, a ghost in the machine. It was never intended to see the light of day. It was a story told to a soundproofed room, a confession made to the void. And the void was about to answer back. Narrator. In the ecosystem of secrets, the spoken word is a fleeting liability. The written word, however, is a permanent threat. The 342-page transcript of Dr. Aris Thorne's testimony was a contagion, and the system's immune response was swift and absolute. Within hours of the classified hearing, the transcript was in the hands of a specialized redaction unit, housed within the National Declassification Center, an ironic name for an office whose primary function was to entomb information. Here, the process of sanitization began. It is a meticulous, almost artistic process. Analysts, working in isolated terminals, cross-reference every name, date, and location mentioned by Thorne against a vast, classified matrix of protected entities and ongoing operations. Project Chimera, Omnicorp, the Quartermaster, each term was flagged. The names of the executives Thorne implicated were blacked out with digital ink, leaving behind ugly, tombstone-like rectangles. Entire paragraphs detailing the chemical formulas and the secret labs were excised, replaced with the sterile, bureaucratic justification pertaining to national defense, pertaining to information prohibited from disclosure by other statutes. Page after page was brutalized. The narrative of Thorne's testimony was dismembered, leaving behind a disjointed, nonsensical collection of prepositions and conjunctions. What was once a coherent confession of profound criminality became an abstract, unreadable document. The original, unredacted digital file was then subjected to a digital burn protocol, encrypted with a key that was then itself destroyed, and wiped from the server using algorithms that overwrite the data dozens of times, ensuring it could never be recovered by even the most sophisticated forensic techniques. The 3 physical copies that were printed were handled with similar finality. 2 were incinerated on site, their ashes collected and stored in a hazardous materials container. The final copy, along with the original audio recording, was placed in a lead-lined, tamper-proof briefcase. It was then transported by a silent courier to a deep underground storage facility, the Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, a place often called the Underground Pentagon. There, it was formally sealed under the National Security Act of 1947 and assigned a declassification review date 150 years in the future. It was filed away, not alphabetically or chronologically, but by a coded designation known only to a handful of individuals. It had officially ceased to exist in any accessible form. The testimony was now a non-entity, a ghost story whispered about by a few intelligence insiders. The act of redaction and sealing is more than just hiding information. It is an act of ontological violence. It declares that a thing that happened did not in fact happen. It retroactively aborts a truth, ensuring it is never born into public consciousness. Dr. Thorne spoke for 6 hours, but the stroke of a censor's pen and the thud of a classification stamp silenced him for centuries. The system had protected itself. The truth was safely locked away, and the stage was now set for a different story to be told to the American people. Narrator: a lie is incomplete without a believable villain. With Dr. Aris Thorne vanished and his testimony buried under a mountain of classification, the official narrative required a face to blame for the Ethelberg disaster. The system found one in Marcus Thorne, Aris's estranged son. Marcus was a mid-level safety inspector at the Ethelberg plant. He was young, idealistic, and had a history of filing minor internal complaints about procedural lapses, enough to make him a nuisance, but not enough to have any real power. This made him the perfect scapegoat. He was close enough to the disaster to be plausible, and insignificant enough that his conviction would cause few ripples. The federal indictment came down 6 months after the spill. The charges were devastating. 28 counts of involuntary manslaughter, criminal negligence, and falsifying safety records. The media, fed a steady diet of selective leaks from the Justice Department, painted him as a disgruntled, lazy employee who cut corners to spite his superiors. The trial was a masterwork of legal theater. The prosecution, led by a formidable U.S. attorney with deep ties to the intelligence community, built a case on a mountain of circumstantial evidence. They presented falsified maintenance logs, where Marcus's signature had been expertly forged. They produced emails, taken out of context, where he complained about his workload. They even brought in a paid expert who testified that the specific valve failure that led to the spill could only have been caused by the deliberate bypassing of safety protocols that fell under Marcus's direct purview. Marcus Thorne's defense team was hopelessly outmatched. They were a small public defender's office, fighting the full weight of the federal government. They knew something was wrong. They could feel the presence of a larger, hidden story. They filed motion after motion to obtain Omnicorp's internal project files and communications, specifically requesting any information related to his father, Dr. Aris Thorne, whose disappearance they found deeply suspicious. Every request was denied, citing corporate proprietary information or, more ominously, national security concerns. The judge, a stern appointee with a history of ruling for the government in sensitive cases, sustained every objection from the prosecution. The defense was fighting a ghost. They couldn't reference Project Chimera because they didn't know it existed. They couldn't call Aris Thorne to the stand because he was gone. They couldn't access the one piece of evidence that would have exonerated their client, the testimony languishing in a vault in Raven Rock. Marcus Thorne, confused and terrified, maintained his innocence, but his pleas were drowned out by the carefully constructed narrative. He was the villain the story needed. After a 3-week trial, the jury took less than a day to return a verdict. Guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom in chains, the lie was cemented into public record. The Ethelberg disaster had its culprit. The case was closed. The real criminals, the architects of Project Chimera, watched the news from their boardrooms and government offices, secure in the knowledge that their secrets were safe and that a convenient scapegoat was paying the price for their crimes. Narrator: official histories are written by the victors, but unofficial histories are kept by the skeptical. Investigator Frank Davies was one of the skeptics. A veteran of the National Transportation Safety Board, Davies had been assigned to the Ethelberg case in the initial days, before the FBI and the DOJ took over and walled everyone else out. He was a meticulous, old-school investigator who trusted physical evidence over official statements. And what he saw at the Ethelberg site didn't add up. The burn patterns were wrong. The chemical residue suggested accelerants far more complex than anything used in the plant's declared manufacturing processes. He saw the subtle but unmistakable signs of a controlled demolition, not a runaway industrial accident. When the case was abruptly federalized and his preliminary findings were confiscated and classified, Davies knew he was being sidelined for a reason. But Frank Davies had a rule: never trust a single copy. For 30 years, he had maintained a private, off-the-books archive in the attic of his suburban home. It was his insurance policy against manufactured truths. He had made duplicates of his key findings from Ethelberg, surreptitious photographs of the blast site, copies of his initial chemical analyses, and a handwritten journal filled with his observations and suspicions. Most importantly, he had a source, a junior clerk on the Congressional Oversight Committee who was terrified by what he had heard during Dr. Thorne's testimony. This clerk had risked everything to pass Davies a single coded message. Chimera is real. They buried the truth with the father. They are framing the son. Davies couldn't act on the information directly. It was career suicide, and likely worse. So, he did the only thing he could. He preserved it. He added the cryptic note to his private Ethelberg file, codenamed it Orpheus, for a hero who went into the underworld to retrieve a lost soul, and hid it away. For 2 decades, the file sat dormant as Davies finished his career, retired, and eventually passed away. The box in his attic became just another forgotten relic. That is, until 2023, when his granddaughter, a journalism student, began clearing out the house. She found the box labeled Orpheus. Inside, she found a story that refused to die. The photographs, the chemical data, the cryptic note about Chimera. It was a breadcrumb trail leading back to a monumental injustice. Davies's files were the last surviving echo of the testimony that was never entered into record. They were not the testimony itself, but a map pointing to the location of its burial. The discovery of these files reignited a cold case that the powerful believed was long since settled. It proved that you can redact a document, seal a recording, and imprison a scapegoat, but you can never truly erase a truth. All you can do is delay its discovery. The real investigation into the Ethelberg disaster, the one that should have happened 20 years ago, was about to begin. Narrator: it wasn't a document, it wasn't a file, it was a Sony micro-cassette. The kind used by journalists and private investigators in the 70s for discreet field interviews. The label, written in hurried, slightly smeared ink, read simply, Albright, BM, do not file. It was tucked inside the hollowed-out spine of an old legal textbook, sharing a dusty tomb with other forgotten procedural manuals. This was item 34, the testimony that was never entered into record. The physical object itself felt like a relic from another world. The plastic was brittle, the tiny spools of magnetic tape wound tightly, a fragile ribbon of stored memory. For over 40 years, it had sat in darkness, its contents a dormant secret. Holding it, you could feel the weight not of the plastic, but of the silence it was meant to enforce. The immediate challenge was playback. Machines that run these tapes are antiques now, their delicate mechanisms prone to failure. Finding a working player in good condition was the first hurdle. The second, and far more significant, was the risk of the tape itself. Magnetic media. This old is notoriously unstable. The tape could be blank. It could be hopelessly degraded. Or worse, the simple act of playing it could wipe it clean. The fragile magnetic particles flaking away, turning the voice it held into nothing more than dust and static. The decision was made to digitize it immediately, to create a perfect one-to-one digital copy before any attempt at restoration. The process was agonizingly slow. Every rotation of the spools felt like a gamble. We watched in a darkened room as the tape fed slowly through the machine, the raw, unprocessed signal appearing as a chaotic waveform on a monitor. There was sound. Not clear, not clean, but it was there. Buried under a thick blanket of hiss, hum, and the unmistakable warble of aged tape, there was a voice. A frightened voice. We couldn't make out the words yet, just the cadence, the rise and fall of a person recounting something terrible. It was the voice of M. Albright. And even through the decades of decay and distortion, the fear was palpable. This wasn't a simple witness statement. This was a confession or an accusation of the highest order, captured on a fragile strand of magnetic tape and condemned to silence. The official story of Blackwood Manor was about to be set on fire all over again. Narrator. Once the raw signal was captured, the real work began. This is the digital autopsy room, where forensic audio specialists act as archaeologists of sound. The recording of M. Albright was a ruin. Decades of magnetic bleed-through, environmental noise, and the natural degradation of the medium had turned it into a near unintelligible mess. The first step was stabilization. Using specialized software, the team corrected the tape's inconsistent speed, a wow and flutter effect that made the speaker's voice drift in and out of pitch, sounding ghostly and warped. Once the speed was locked, the noise floor was attacked. This isn't a simple filter. It's a meticulous process of identifying the specific frequencies of the electrical hum, the tape hiss, and the mechanical noise of the original recorder. Each layer of unwanted sound is isolated, its sonic fingerprint identified, and then surgically removed from the recording. It's like cleaning a priceless painting one speck of dust at a time. After hours of this painstaking work, the voice began to emerge from the static, like a shape forming in the fog. It was a woman's voice, frail but resolute. We could now begin the process of spectral analysis, visualizing the sound to see the words, not just hear them. The formants, the resonant frequencies of the human vocal tract, were analyzed to enhance intelligibility. And slowly, fragment by fragment, the testimony that was never entered into record began to speak. Voice. He wasn't alone. I saw the car. A black sedan, no plates. The other man, he was official. He wore a suit, but he carried the fire. Narrator. The words sent a chill through the lab. Alistair Finch, the man who confessed, was not alone. The arson was not a simple act of a desperate man. According to Monsieur Albright, someone else was there. Someone official. The team worked feverishly, cross-referencing the timestamp data embedded in the tape's electronic signature with the official police logs from that night. Albright's statement was recorded less than 3 hours after the first emergency call. It was fresh. It was immediate. And it described a second person at the scene, a person who was not in any police report, any interview, or any part of the official case file. The testimony went on to describe this second man not as an accomplice, but as the instigator, the one who directed Finch, threatening him. This wasn't insurance fraud. This was a forced demolition. A professional hit on a building with a convenient scapegoat left to take the fall. The question was no longer what MC Albright said, but why her testimony was buried so completely and effectively that it took a chance discovery 40 years later to bring it to light. Narrator. A story is a timeline. A cause is B, which leads to C. The official timeline for the Blackwood Manor incident was brutally simple. At 11 p.m., Alistair Finch, facing bankruptcy, buys gasoline. At 1:30 a.m., he sets fire to his ancestral home. At 4 a.m., he is apprehended by police. At 9 a.m., he confesses. Case closed. But MC Albright's testimony shatters that sequence. It introduces a new element, a ghost in the timeline that changes everything. We must now construct a new sequence of events, the one they tried to bury. Narrator. Our new timeline begins a week before the fire. Local Planning Commission records, cross-referenced with Albright's testimony, show that a major land development project was controversially rejected. The project's primary beneficiary, a powerful holding company with deep political ties, the sole obstacle to their multi-million-dollar expansion, Blackwood Manor, a historically protected building owned by Alistair Finch, who had refused every offer to sell. Suddenly, the motive is no longer a paltry insurance payout. It's real estate. It's power. Narrator. Now let's look at the night of the fire. Albright, a neighbor, testified she saw a black sedan arrive at 1:15 a.m. She saw Finch meet another man. She heard arguing. This second man, the official from the tape, fits the description of a known fixer for the holding company, a man who disappeared from public record 2 years after the fire. He wasn't just there. He was orchestrating it. The fire was not an act of desperation, but of coercion. Finch didn't burn his house down for money. He burned it down because he was threatened. His confession, given just hours later without a lawyer present, was not an admission of guilt, but an act of self-preservation for his family. The testimony that was never entered into record was the key that unlocked the real crime. The arson was merely the final act. The true crime was the conspiracy behind it, the junior detective who logged the tape. He was transferred to a remote precinct a week later and left the force within the year. M. Albright? We can find no record of her after 1979. She vanished. The system didn't just misplace a piece of evidence. It actively and methodically erased a crime, silenced a witness, and destroyed the lives of those who dared to tell the truth. The file is closed, but the case is anything but. Write in the comments where you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like. Some truths are not just hidden. They are actively hunted. Welcome back to the Obsidian Archive. Tonight we descend into a chasm of institutional silence, a void created by a force so powerful it can not only classify a document, but erase the very memory of its existence. We are talking about the monolithic entities we entrust with our security, the alphabet agencies that operate in the shadows. And at the heart of this darkness lies a ghost, a piece of evidence known only in whispers as the testimony that was never entered into record. Our journey begins not with a bang, but with a deafening silence. In the aftermath of the Shijian, a term we must use, as its official name is sealed under more layers of classification than the location of the president's bunker, there was supposed to be a reckoning. A closed-door hearing. A single witness, codenamed Witness Zero, was scheduled to provide a full accounting. This testimony was rumored to contain details so explosive it could have reshaped the political landscape, exposed clandestine operations, and held the untouchable to account. But the hearing never happened. The scheduled date came and went. In the official ledgers, the entry for that session is simply blank. Not canceled, not postponed. Just empty. As if it were a phantom appointment that never was. Our team filed dozens of Freedom of Information Act requests. We targeted the NSA, the CIA, the DIA, and even obscure sub-departments whose budgets are blacker than a starless night. The responses when they came were a masterclass in bureaucratic obfuscation. Most were rejected outright, citing national security exemptions, the familiar shield used to deflect uncomfortable questions. One response from a low-level Pentagon clerk: was different. It stated, "We have no records responsive to your request." Not that the records were classified, but that they didn't exist. This is the first rule of a successful cover-up. Don't hide the evidence. Destroy the proof that evidence ever existed. We spoke to a retired congressional aide who agreed to talk on the condition of absolute anonymity. He remembers the buzz around the scheduled hearing. "It was the only thing anyone on the Hill was talking about," he told us, his voice a low rasp over a secure line. "We heard Zero's testimony was going to be the linchpin. It was the first-hand account that connected all the dots. Then one morning it was just gone. The committee chairman was told the witness was no longer available. The session was stricken. Anyone who asked questions was quietly reminded where their career ambitions lay. The agency's silence is not passive. It is an active, ongoing operation. It is the digital scrubbing of databases, the alteration of archival records, the subtle intimidation of anyone who might remember. They didn't just lock the file away. They burned the library card, demolished the library, and salted the earth where it once stood. The absence of the testimony has become more significant than its potential contents. It is a monument to the power of the unseen hand, a chilling testament to the fact that in the halls of power, truth is not what happened. It is what is allowed to be remembered. When official records are a dead end, and the state feigns ignorance, all that remains is the sprawling, chaotic landscape of theory. Why would an agency expend such immense resources to erase a single testimony? The vacuum left by the facts has been filled with speculation, each theory more disturbing than the last. We must navigate these murky waters with caution, but to ignore them would be to ignore the only remaining echoes of Witness Zero's voice. The most prevalent theory, one that circulates among former intelligence analysts and investigative journalists, is that the testimony detailed a catastrophic failure in a Black Ops program. Imagine a mission deep in foreign territory, gone so horribly wrong that it violated international law, resulted in the deaths of civilians, or perhaps even friendly fire on an allied nation. Witness Zero, likely an operative or a high-level planner, was the sole survivor or the dissenter with a conscience. Their testimony would not just be embarrassing. It would be a geopolitical firestorm, shattering alliances and potentially leading to war. Suppressing it wouldn't be a choice. It would be a state-level imperative. Another more insidious theory points towards illegal domestic surveillance. In this scenario, Witness Zero was a technician, an engineer, or a data analyst who discovered that the agency had turned its powerful surveillance apparatus inward, targeting its own citizens without warrants, without oversight, in direct violation of the Constitution. The testimony would have been the ultimate proof. The technical specifications, the operational code words, the names of the targets. It would have confirmed the deepest fears of a populace already wary of government overreach. The ensuing scandal would have dismantled the agency from the inside out and led to criminal charges at the highest levels. The cover-up then was an act of institutional self-preservation. But then there are the whispers from the fringe, the theories that sound like fiction until you examine the periphery of the case. Some researchers, piecing together declassified but heavily censored documents from unrelated projects, suggest Witness Zero's testimony concerned something far more profound: the successful recovery of non-terrestrial technology. According to this theory, the incident was not a military or political event, but a technological one. Witness Zero was a scientist or an engineer who had first-hand experience with an object or a piece of hardware that defied our known physics. The testimony would have been the scientific data, the material analysis, the irrefutable proof that we are not alone. The implications of such a revelation are incalculable. It would shatter paradigms in religion, science, and society. For a government obsessed with control, such chaos is the ultimate threat. Each theory paints a different portrait of the same crime, the murder of truth. Whether it was to hide a battlefield atrocity, a betrayal of public trust, or a reality-altering secret, the motive remains the same: the preservation of power. The testimony was a key that could unlock a Pandora's box of secrets, and the agency, acting as its gatekeeper, decided to melt the key and deny the box ever existed. A name is a powerful thing. It provides a history, a face, a human connection. But the architects of this silence knew that. They stripped our witness of their name, reducing them to a sterile code name: Witness Zero. It's a designation that is both a title and an erasure. They were the first, and ultimately the last. But Zero was a person. Before they became a ghost in the machine, they had a life. Through painstaking research, and by connecting with sources who knew them, we have pieced together a fractured portrait of their final days. For the purpose of our investigation, we will call him Elias. Elias was not a field operative in the traditional sense. He was a systems analyst, a man who dealt in patterns, data, and the quiet flow of information. He was meticulous, trusted, and had a security clearance that gave him access to the digital skeleton of the agency. His colleagues described him as quiet, observant, and intensely principled. It was this principle that would become his undoing. The change in Elias began approximately 3 months before the scheduled testimony. Friends recall him becoming withdrawn and paranoid. He started taking different routes home from work. He covered the camera on his laptop and began speaking in hushed tones, even in his own apartment. He told one trusted friend, "They see everything. They hear everything. The machine we built, it's not looking outward anymore." This was the crux of his discovery. Elias had stumbled upon a program, a digital ghost that had been turned loose within the nation's own infrastructure, collecting data on an unprecedented scale. He had found the source code. He had found the server logs. He had found the truth. He followed protocol at first. He went to his direct superior. He was told, politely but firmly, to drop it. When he persisted, he was placed on administrative leave. That's when he knew the rot went all the way to the top. He contacted a trusted contact on a congressional oversight committee, and the secret hearing was arranged. In the 2 weeks leading up to his testimony, the pressure intensified. His apartment was broken into, but nothing was stolen. His car's brakes failed on a clear, dry day. He would see the same unfamiliar faces in his neighborhood coffee shop. These weren't clumsy scare tactics. They were precise, psychological signals. "They're telling me they can reach me," he confided to his sister. "They want me to know there is no safe place." His final known communication was an encrypted message to the congressional aide organizing the hearing. It contained only a single sentence: "The evidence is secure. They can't stop the signal." The next day, Elias vanished. His car was found at a long-term parking garage at the airport. His apartment was empty, wiped clean with a professional's touch. No note, no signs of struggle. He simply ceased to be. Witness Zero was no longer unavailable. he was gone. His disappearance was the final brutal redaction, ensuring the testimony that was never entered into record would remain exactly that, a story with no teller. We arrive at the end of our investigation, but not at a conclusion. We stand at the edge of a void, staring into an absence of information so profound it has its own gravity. The case of Witness Zero and the testimony that was never entered into record is not a story with a neat ending. It is a scar on the public record, a testament to the fact that the most significant truths are often the ones that are never spoken aloud. What have we learned? We know a person, a principled analyst we call Elias, discovered a terrible truth. We know he intended to reveal it, to speak it into the official record under the protection of a congressional committee. And we know that before he could, the system he sought to expose mobilized against him. The agency, in an act of supreme and terrifying power, did not just silence a man. They erased the very event where his voice was to be heard. The silence is the confession. The empty space in the ledger, the no records response, the disappearance of a man, these are not evidence of nothing. They are evidence of everything. They prove the existence of a power accountable to no one, a shadow state that operates with impunity, whose first and only directive is its own preservation. The unresolved nature of this case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many other Witness Zeros have there been? How many other testimonies have been scheduled and then quietly erased from history? The documents that govern a free society are filled with promises of transparency and accountability. Yet this case demonstrates that those promises can be broken with no consequence. The truth Elias died to protect remains a ghost. It may be locked on a server in a subterranean data center, or perhaps it exists only in the memories of a few old men who will take the secret to their graves. But the story's power lies in its incompletion. It serves as a permanent warning. It reminds us that official histories are often carefully curated narratives, shaped by what is included, but defined more powerfully by what is omitted. The testimony was never entered into the record, but its absence has been entered into ours. It is a challenge to all of us to question, to dig, to refuse to accept the silence, to remember that the most important stories are often the ones we are told do not exist. The truth is still out there, waiting. But the question remains, in a world of locked files and official denials, are we still capable of recognizing it?